Under a hillside graveyard in Hancock County, Tennessee, a 200-year-old family lie was waiting to be broken apart by a single blood test. Everyone believed the Melungeons were the last descendants of shipwrecked Portuguese sailors, hidden for centuries in the Appalachian Hills. They weren't. They were survivors of a Tennessee law built to strip away everything they owned. Druanna Overbay grew up defending that Portuguese story as her own family's heritage until her own DNA test came back wrong. In 2012, scientists finally opened the case her ancestors spent 2 centuries trying to keep closed. It cut deeper than expected. Walk this ridge slowly, and you notice something ODD before anyone tells you a single fact. The graves are old, but they're inconsistent. Some names are carved deep and formal. Others are scratched onto fieldstone, barely legible, as if whoever buried them didn't want the record to last too long. A handful of small stone grave houses still stand, little roofed structures built to shelter individual graves, a tradition almost nowhere else in Tennessee. Locals here have carried one surname or another for generations: Collins, Gibson, Mullins, Goins, Bunch, Bowling. For a long time, the world called them Melungeons, a word first written down in 1813 in the minutes of the Stony Creek Primitive Baptist Church across the state line in Scott County, Virginia. The entry complained about harboring them Melungeons. It wasn't a compliment. It was a warning. The label wasn't attached to a handful of eccentric hermits. Contemporary accounts pinned it to roughly 40 interrelated families living across the ridge and the valley below. A real, countable community, not a rumor. That number matters. 40 families is small enough to track through court records for 2 centuries, and small enough that a single genetic study, done right, could eventually speak for almost everyone whose name showed up on those stones. By the early 1800s, these families were living along the ridge and the valley below it, in a settlement that would come to be called Vardy, named for an early patriarch, Vardaman Collins. Hancock County didn't even exist yet. It was carved out of Claiborne and Hawkins counties in 1844, almost as if the region needed a new box to put these people in. And the world outside noticed them, not gently. Newspapers as far back as 1848 ran breathless little pieces describing a society of Portuguese adventurers living deep in the mountains, distinct from their white and black neighbors. Later, the story would grow stranger and more exotic. Shipwrecked Ottoman sailors wandering moors, remnants of Sir Walter Raleigh's lost colony, even Phoenician traders who supposedly crossed an ocean and forgot to mention it to anyone else in recorded history. In Claiborne County, some families used a different shield entirely, calling themselves Black Dutch, a vague label that let them keep a foothold in local politics without ever answering the harder question underneath it. For over a century, that mystery made the Melungeons famous, in a strange regional way. They weren't just an isolated mountain community. They were treated like a genuine historical puzzle, a population whose exact bloodline nobody could pin down, hiding in plain sight in the hills between Tennessee and Virginia. In 1903, a local attorney and amateur historian named Lewis Jarvis added yet another layer, describing the Melungeons in his own writings as friendly Indians who had migrated into the region alongside white settlers sometime between 1795 and 1812. It was one more version of the same instinct: reach for any origin story except the one the law actually punished. By the late 20th century, that mystery had become something else entirely, a source of pride. In 1994, author N. Brent Kennedy published a book claiming the Melungeons carried Mediterranean, Turkish, and Moorish ancestry, an exotic, sweeping origin story that framed them as survivors of ancient wandering peoples rather than a stigmatized American underclass. The book ignited a genuine cultural movement. Melungeon descendants across the country began researching their roots with excitement instead of shame, chasing a heritage that sounded less like the Jim Crow South and more like an ancient Mediterranean epic. By the 1990s, the Melungeon story wasn't confined to Appalachia anymore. National magazines ran features on the mystery people of the Tennessee Hills. genealogy societies organized panels. College courses cited the Melungeons as a case study in unresolved American identity. A story that began as a slur scratched into a church's minutes had become, 180 years later, a genuine national curiosity, the kind of unsolved mystery people wanted to believe in, because the alternative explanation was so much harder to sit with. But there was a problem, and it had been sitting quietly in the county courthouse the entire time. Long before anyone tested a single strand of DNA, the paper trail on these families had never made sense. Census takers moving through Hancock County across different decades didn't just disagree slightly on how to classify the same families. They contradicted themselves completely. One census taker in 1890 recorded the Collins and Gibson households as Indian. In the very same county in the same year, Mullins families were logged as white, Denham families as Portuguese, and Goins families as Negro, enumerators later admitting they simply wrote down the races which they most resembled. Read that again. Officials weren't recording ancestry. They were recording a guess based on how dark someone's skin looked on a given afternoon. That should unsettle you. It's the first sign that whatever the truth of Melungeon origin actually was, nobody in power was interested in finding it. They wanted a label that was convenient, not accurate. To understand why that convenience mattered so badly, you have to go back further than any cemetery. In 1705, the Virginia colony passed a law that formally defined a mulatto as anyone with a black or mixed-race grandparent or great-grandparent, a legal mechanism specifically built to track and restrict people exactly like these families for generations to come. That single law created a permanent, inherited legal category, one that would follow bloodlines like a shadow no migration could fully outrun. Paul Heinig, a genealogist who spent years combing colonial Virginia and North Carolina court records, tax lists, and deeds, reconstructed the histories of hundreds of free black families stretching back to the 1600s. What he found, repeatedly, was a pattern. Unions between European indentured servant women and African men, occurring before slavery in the colonies, had hardened into the rigid, racialized system it would later become. Their children were born free. Decades before Heinig, a cultural geographer named Edward Price reached almost the same conclusion from a completely different direction. In a dissertation in a journal article published around 1950, Price traced the Melungeons' movement into Hancock County from the Virginia and North Carolina Piedmont in the late 1700s and early 1800s, and concluded plainly that they descended from free people of color, not from any exotic foreign population. It was a quiet academic finding, buried in a geography journal, decades before DNA testing even existed as a tool. Nobody outside a small circle of scholars paid much attention. The romantic version of the story was simply more comfortable to believe. So these families moved. Free people of color pushed steadily southwest through Virginia and into the Carolinas, then into the mountainous borderlands of what would become Tennessee, land that was harder to farm, harder to police, and easier to disappear into. It should have been a fresh start. It wasn't. In 1830, the Federal Indian Removal Act turned Indian identity into a death sentence for land and liberty across the Southeast, culminating in the Cherokee removal along the Trail of Tears in 1838. Suddenly, claiming native ancestry, something these families may genuinely have had in some lines, became dangerous too, and then, in 1834, Tennessee rewrote its state constitution to restrict voting to every free white man, stripping free persons of color of the vote, the right to serve on juries, and the right to testify against a white person in court. For families with any documented African or Indian ancestry, 3 doors slammed shut in the space of 4 years. Black was dangerous, Indian was dangerous, and now, in Tennessee specifically, anything but white meant losing your voice in a courtroom entirely. This is the moment the mystery stops being about romance and starts being about survival. If you were a Melungeon family in the 1830s in Hancock County, Portuguese wasn't an exotic fantasy. It was a legal shield. Claim Mediterranean blood, claim shipwrecked sailors, claim anything that wasn't black and wasn't Indian. And you had a chance, a real legal chance at keeping your vote, your testimony, your land, your children's future. The myth wasn't born from wonder. It was engineered from fear. And the courts noticed the pattern too, whether they admitted it or not. In the 1840s, several Melungeon men were formally prosecuted for illegal voting, charged specifically as free persons of color. One case went before a jury on January 29, 1848. Historian and genealogist Jack Goins later confirmed that the men actually charged carried documented African paternal lines, meaning the state, in some cases, was aiming its racial law directly at families whose ancestry it half suspected, even without any scientific proof at all. Court dockets from the period don't spell out a tidy verdict in every case, and that gap is its own kind of evidence. Whatever happened inside that jury room in January of 1848, the mere fact that a Melungeon man could be hauled into a Tennessee courtroom and forced to defend his right to vote based purely on his appearance and his neighbor's suspicion tells you everything about the stakes attached to a word like Portuguese. Imagine standing in that courtroom. Your freedom, your vote, your family's legal existence hinges on a story about Portuguese sailors that nobody in that room can actually verify. And yet the story is the only thing standing between you and losing everything. Nowhere does that desperation show more clearly than in a Tennessee Supreme Court case from 1872. A woman named Martha Simmerman, granddaughter of a man named Solomon Bolton, stood to inherit a 600-acre farm on Moccasin Bend, but only if her family's ancestry could be proven free of African blood. Her attorney, Lewis Shepard, didn't argue against an exotic origin story. He built the entire case on one. He told the court the Bolton family descended from ancient Carthaginians and Phoenicians who had settled long ago in Portugal, sailed across the Atlantic centuries later, and carried that ancient Mediterranean blood into the Tennessee mountains. Anything at all except African. It worked. Martha Simmerman kept her farm. And a legend that sounds, on its surface, like folklore invented by isolated hill families for fun, turns out, in at least one documented case, to have been argued in open court by a licensed attorney in front of a sitting judge as the difference between a woman owning 600 acres and owning nothing at all. And the legal jeopardy didn't fade with the 19th century. In 1924, Virginia passed the Racial Integrity Act, enforced with obsessive zeal by a state registrar named Walter Plecker, who spent decades reclassifying entire families as colored based on nothing more than a surname on his personal watch list. Some historians researching that era have noted something colder still. Architects of racial law in Nazi Germany later studied American statutes like Virginia's when drafting their own classification system. A law built in a Tennessee courthouse to protect one farm had within a lifetime become part of a much larger and darker story about what a government decides a bloodline is worth. That's the strange thing about the Portuguese legend and the Turkish legend that came later. They sound absurd from the outside, but they weren't invented by fools. They were built, brick by brick, out of genuine legal terror, a mountain community reaching for the only story that might let them keep what little they had. And for over 100 years, nobody had the tools to check whether any of it was true. By the late 20th century, the exotic version of the story had mostly won, and it had a very personal engine behind it. Brent Kennedy, the author who reignited the Turkish and Mediterranean theory in 1994, had been diagnosed with a rare illness, his doctors associated with Mediterranean ancestry. Searching for an explanation for his own body, he went looking for his own bloodline and found the Melungeons waiting at the end of it. His book turned a private medical mystery into a public ethnic one, and thousands of descendants followed him into it, embracing a heritage that felt ancient and proud rather than legally coerced. But not every historian was convinced. In 1996, genealogist Virginia DeMars published a pointed rebuttal in the Society's own quarterly journal, accusing Kennedy of sweeping in virtually every olive, ruddy, and brown-tinged ethnicity known or alleged to have appeared anywhere in the pre-Civil War southeastern United States. It was a polite way of saying, you have a beautiful story and almost no documentary evidence behind it. Kennedy wrote a rebuttal. The journal declined to publish it. DeMars wasn't a new critic circling the subject for the first time. 4 years earlier, in 1992, she had already published foundational research in the same journal on what scholars call triracial isolate families, small, endogamous communities of mixed European, African, and Native ancestry scattered across the Upper South, of which the Melungeons were only the most famous example. Her framework didn't deny the families existed or that their ancestry was genuinely mixed. It denied that mixture needed an exotic overseas explanation at all, when a much closer, much harder domestic one already fit the paperwork. Still, the theory persisted because it was emotionally satisfying, and because for decades nobody could definitively disprove it. That's the trap of a theory like this. It doesn't need to be true. It only needs to be unfalsifiable. And for most of the 20th century it was. Then science caught up to the mountain. In 2000, a British biologist named Kevin Jones, working with the University of Virginia's College at Wise and University College London, ran the first real genetic survey of Melungeon-descended families, roughly 130 hair and cheek samples. It should have been the moment everything got answered. It wasn't. The results came back murky, roughly matching the surrounding regional population. One tabulation of his results put the sample at roughly 83% European ancestry, about 5% Native American, and about 5% African, numbers close enough to the general Appalachian population around them that they proved almost nothing on their own. No smoking gun, no confirmation of Portuguese blood, no confirmation of Turkish blood, nothing dramatic enough to settle 150 years of speculation. It was the first crack in the noise, proof that a Melungeon origin story could finally be tested with real science. But it raised the stakes without paying them off. Meanwhile, back on the ridge, something quieter was happening. In 2008, a graduate researcher named Sherry Lynn Tejada completed a master's thesis in geography at Virginia Tech, surveying 116 cemeteries scattered across Hancock County. She walked the ground herself, family plot by family plot, cataloging gravestone types, dates, and a strange, fading local tradition of small wooden and stone grave houses built to shelter individual graves, structures found almost nowhere else in the state. She built what she called a Melungeon burial index, mapping which cemeteries still held on to older, distinctive burial customs, and which had already blended fully into standard American gravestone styles. Her finding was quietly devastating in its own way. Over 93% of the cemeteries she surveyed showed what she termed complete burial assimilation. The old markers, the old customs, the visible fingerprints of a distinct culture, they were vanishing from the landscape in real time. She wasn't digging up bodies. She was documenting names, dates, and stones before they disappeared entirely, tying real surnames, real family plots, and real physical locations directly to the same bloodlines that genealogists and geneticists had spent decades arguing over. It was preservation, not excavation. But it mattered enormously because it meant that when a deeper genetic study finally came, researchers would know exactly which stones, which plots, and which unbroken family lines to trace it back to. That deeper study arrived in 2012. and it did not confirm anything the community had spent 2 centuries believing. To understand what it actually did, you need to understand what it was testing. Why DNA passes almost unchanged from father to son, generation after generation, like a name carried down an unbroken male line. Mitochondrial DNA works the same way through mothers, passed to every child, but only carried forward by daughters. Together, they act like 2 separate tape recordings of ancestry, one running down the paternal side, one down the maternal side, stretching back centuries without the static of ordinary inheritance. Every population on Earth carries these markers, sorted into what geneticists call haplogroups, deep genetic lineages that can be traced back thousands of years and linked to broad regions of origin: Europe, West Africa, the Americas, and beyond. A haplogroup doesn't tell you a person's whole story, but it tells you with real confidence which side of an ocean a specific unbroken bloodline actually came from. Test them against a family tree that's been documented back far enough, and you're not guessing anymore. You're listening directly to the line itself. Researchers Roberta Estes, Jack Goins, Penny Ferguson, and Janet Lewis Crane built exactly that kind of listening project. Their work grew out of the Core Melungeon DNA Project, founded in 2005 through the genetic testing company Family Tree DNA, where volunteer descendants submitted cheek swabs alongside their documented genealogies. In 2012, the team published Melungeons, a multi-ethnic population, in the peer-reviewed Journal of Genetic Genealogy, the most rigorous scientific test the mystery had ever received. Instead of broad, scattered sampling, they focused tightly on documented, unbroken family lines. 69 Y-DNA paternal lines and 8 mitochondrial maternal lines, all traceable through the generations of genealogical paperwork back to the original core Melungeon surnames, the same names carved into the stones on Newman's Ridge. This wasn't guesswork. This was direct line testing, tracing father to father, mother to mother, straight back through 2.5 centuries. The surnames the 2012 study traced were the same names carved across those Newman's Ridge stones: Collins, Gibson, Goins, Mullins, Bunch, Bowling, Denham, Williams, Minor, Moore, Sizemore, Riddle, Perkins, Hopkins. 14 family names, tested one bloodline at a time, each one a decision some ancestor made about which story to tell a census taker, a judge, or a neighbor. The results landed like a verdict nobody had asked for. The paternal line split almost exactly in half between European and sub-Saharan African ancestry. Every single maternal line tested came back European. There was no core Native American direct paternal or maternal line at all, not a trace of the Cherokee ancestry so many families had quietly claimed, not a whisper of the Turkish or Mediterranean bloodline Kennedy's book had made famous. The Portuguese legend, the Turkish legend, the Phoenician legend argued in a Tennessee courtroom in 1872. None of it held up under a Y chromosome. It's worth being precise about what that test could and couldn't say. 69 paternal lines and 8 maternal lines are a real, documented sample. But they are not every Melungeon family, and they only trace one direct thread each: father to father or mother to mother, ignoring every other branch of the tree. The study didn't claim to map every ancestor of every living descendant. It claimed something narrower and, in some ways, more damning: that the core, founding bloodlines of the community, the ones the Portuguese legend was built to protect, were not what the legend said they were. And the mismatches went even deeper, family by family. The Riddle line had generations of paper documentation claiming Native American ancestry and tested purely European. The Sizemore line, by contrast, had no such paperwork, no family story insisting on Indian blood, and tested genetically Native American anyway. 2 families, opposite outcomes, both contradicting exactly what their own written history claimed. It was as if the paper trail and the biological trail had been arguing with each other for 200 years, and the DNA had finally shown up to settle the fight, only to reveal that almost nobody's version had been entirely honest, including their own. This should have ended the debate. It didn't. If anything, it opened a harder one. Family message boards and DNA project forums are still, more than a decade later, litigating exactly what that 50-50 paternal split really means for households where the Portuguese story had been repeated as literal fact for 5 generations. Because the finding wasn't just, these families are mixed. Researchers connected it directly back to the colonial paper trail Heinig had reconstructed decades earlier. European servant women, African men, unions in the 1600s and 1700s in Virginia, long before slavery calcified into the brutal, rigid system that would follow. The Melungeons weren't the descendants of exotic shipwrecked foreigners. They were, in the plainest reading of the strongest evidence available, the descendants of some of America's earliest free black families. Families who had spent a century and a half building an elaborate, legally necessary disguise to survive a country that would have stripped them of everything the moment that African ancestry became visible on paper. The story broke nationally. The Associated Press, through reporter Travis Lawler, ran the findings in May of 2012, and outlets from NBC to Fox News to the Huffington Post picked it up within days. Lead researcher Roberta Estes told the AP plainly, there were a whole lot of people upset by this study. They just knew they were Portuguese or Native American. Wayne Winkler, a past president of the Melungeon Heritage Association and the author of a book on the community, put the human cost of the reversal even more bluntly. It's sometimes embarrassing to see the lengths your ancestors went to hide their African heritage, he said, but look at the consequences. They suffered anyway because of the suspicion. Read that quote again slowly. The LIE didn't even work. Families spent generations constructing a Portuguese identity specifically to avoid the legal punishment reserved for black Americans, and the surrounding society suspected them anyway, discriminated against them anyway, isolated them on that ridge anyway. The disguise cost them their true history, and it never even bought them the safety it promised. Not every study agreed cleanly with the findings from 2012, and that matters too. A separate 2010 project by Donald Yates and Elizabeth Hirschman, published through a commercial DNA testing company and enrolling around 40 participants, used broader autosomal sampling and reported stronger Native American admixture than the Estes team found. It's weaker science, commercially entangled, less tightly tied to documented direct lines, but it's part of the honest record, and it's part of why the debate never fully died. Genetics on a small, isolated, heavily intermarried population is messy. Different methods, different sample sizes, different questions asked of the same DNA can produce different shades of the same picture. The core finding, the roughly even European-African paternal split, the entirely European maternal lines, the collapse of the exotic Mediterranean legend, remains the best supported reading. But best supported is not the same as unanimous. And in a story already built on a century and a half of convenient half-truths, that gap was more than enough room for the argument to keep breathing. The Turkish theory, in particular, had grown into something bigger than one book. By the early 2000s, some advocates were claiming that as many as 1 million Appalachians carried Turkish ancestry, a figure amplified by Turkish-American cultural organizations eager to claim a deep American root story of their own. When the 2012 results came out, that claim collapsed publicly. Journalist Tim Hashaw and columnist Harut Sassoonian both went into print rejecting the million-person estimate outright, pointing to the same DNA data that had just dismantled the Portuguese legend. A theory that had traveled from a mountain courtroom to international cultural diplomacy came apart over the same set of Y chromosomes. It's still breathing today. The Melungeon Heritage Association continues to hold annual gatherings it calls unions, genuine family reunions blended with historical and genetic discussion, drawing descendants from across the country, and now backed by its own recurring podcast, Melungeon Voices, still producing new episodes years after the 2012 reversal. Recent unions have been held in Berea, Kentucky, in Hillsborough, North Carolina, and in Johnson City, Tennessee, co-hosted with the Vardy Community Historical Society, each one drawing a slightly different generation of descendants asking the same unresolved question. That society was founded in the late 1990s by Drew Anna Williams Overbay and her husband Fred. Drew Anna herself, a direct descendant of Vardaman Collins, the same patriarch the valley is named for. Together, they restored the old 1899 Vardy Presbyterian Church into a working museum and relocated the log cabin of Mahala Mullins, a legendary local moonshiner known to her neighbors as Big Haley, who died in 1898, back to the Vardy site around the year 2000. Overbay went on to write her own book on the community's history, titled Windows on the Past, drawn from a lifetime spent inside the same families the 2012 study would later test. And she has publicly acknowledged something almost nobody expects to hear from someone this deeply embedded in her own family's research. Her own personal commercial DNA tests, taken more than once, have returned conflicting results. Not clean confirmation, not clean denial. Contradiction in her own genetic code, decades after the definitive 2012 study was supposed to have settled things for good, from the very woman who spent years restoring the church at the center of the whole mystery. The Vardy Community Historical Society still keeps its own accounting of these things. Church, cabin, cemetery, cataloged and maintained by volunteers who are, in most cases, distant cousins of the people buried on the hill above them. It is a strange kind of stewardship, preserving the physical evidence of a story your own DNA has already contradicted, because the stones and the structures are real, even when the legend attached to them wasn't. That's not a flaw in the science. That's the honest, uncomfortable shape of testing a small, endogamous population whose family trees have been quietly tangled together for 2.5 centuries. Consumer autosomal tests, built on broad statistical population comparisons, simply were not designed to untangle a knot this specific and this old. The direct line why DNA and mitochondrial work from 2012 remains the sharpest tool anyone has used. It is not the same thing as a perfect closed case. And into that lingering gap, something newer and stranger has crept. In recent years, low-quality websites have published breathless articles claiming that scientists finally cracked the Melungeon mystery in 2025 with sweeping new genetic panels and dramatic new discoveries. Trace them back, and there's no named researcher behind them, no journal, no verifiable study. They read like content generated to chase search traffic on a topic people already know is unresolved. A modern echo, almost poetic in its irony, of the exact same instinct that built the Portuguese legend in 1848. When the true story is uncertain and uncomfortable, someone, somewhere will always manufacture a cleaner one to sell. There are real stakes on every side of this now. For genealogists and historians, the 2012 study was vindication because decades of paper trail work, dismissed for years as unglamorous compared to Kennedy's Mediterranean epic, had finally been confirmed by hard genetic evidence. For some descendants, it was something closer to a small grief, watching a proud, chosen identity dissolve into a history of racial law and forced disguise. And for the handful of writers still pushing Turkish, Portuguese, or Phoenician theories online, the DNA data is inconvenient at best, a permanent obstacle standing between their version of the story and the version the science actually supports. The debate hasn't gone quiet in the years since. The Melungeon Heritage Association's own podcast, Melungeon Voices, was still releasing new seasons in 2025, still fielding questions from descendants who want the Portuguese story to be true, or the Turkish story, or the Cherokee story, anything but the plainer, harder answer, sitting in a peer-reviewed paper from 2012. That's not ignorance, it's grief in a strange form. An entire community losing not an ancestor but an origin story they had built their identity around for 200 years. So where does that leave the ridge? The graves are still there. The fog still moves through them most mornings the way it did before anyone tested a single sample of DNA. Some of the fieldstones still lean. Some of the names are still gone, worn smooth by 200 years of Tennessee weather. But you can't look at them the same way now. Every Collins, every Gibson, every Mullins, every Goins carved into that hillside carried a secret its own family spent a century and a half trying not to know. And when the science finally answered the question, it wasn't a triumphant homecoming to some ancient exotic bloodline. It was a quiet, devastating confirmation that the safest lie in American history was also one of the loneliest. The Melungeon mystery was never really about Portuguese sailors, or lost Turks, or wandering Phoenicians. It was about what a family will invent, generation after generation, when the truth could cost them their vote, their land, their voice in a courtroom, their children's future. The DNA didn't just answer a question about ancestry. It answered a question about fear, and about how far people will go to outrun a law that was never designed to let them go free in the first place. Stand on that ridge today, at dusk, when the light goes low and gold across the fieldstones, and the names blur just enough that you have to lean in close to read them. The cemetery hasn't moved in 200 years. The paperwork moved constantly, shifting from Indian to Portuguese to white to Negro and back again, decade after decade, whenever it was convenient for someone else to decide who these families were allowed to be. Somewhere nearby, in the restored church that bears the same name as the valley, a woman who has spent her life defending this community still carries genetic results that refuse to agree with each other. The graves never lied. They just waited for someone to finally ask them the right question.